Look, I'm a chair of an advisory board to the Griffith Asia Institute, and I also work for a Japanese corporation, the Mitsubishi, or part of the Mitsubishi Group. But formerly I was in DFAT and spent a good proportion of my career overseas, mainly in Asian posts, but also the United States. Well, I was ambassador to the US, Japan, Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, and Mexico, and I was High Commissioner, which is the same as an ambassador, to India. And I also had roles in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Well, look, I think, if you're an ambassador, what is probably the most crucial aspect of your work is that it is extremely varied, because you're representing really all activities in a government in a particular country, or of a government to another particular country. So, at the same time, in the same day, you can be talking about, for example, a trade agreement. You can be trying to analyze with staff what is happening politically, if there's a crisis with another country. There may be a consular case which is on the boil, which requires attention because they get so much publicity in Australia. And then, there is a certain amount of work on purely representational functions. I mean, there's the famous saying, 90% of life is just showing up. Well, it's not 90%, but it's certainly 20%. That's actually the same with most high-profile jobs, not just diplomacy. Look, I think probably the most interesting is being in foreign environments, dealing with a whole variety of separate situations, separate subjects, different people. All that is very stimulating. The minus is probably the same as in a lot of jobs, that you do get repetition, even in what seems to be a very glamorous job. There is a certain amount of sheer drudgery. You also have to, you are actually working for a government, so you have to do what you're asked to do. You can't just have free rein in deciding what you're going to do with your day or your week or your month. So, there are downsides in any job, but I think there is a certain amount of drudgery and repetition. But I think probably with this particular job, there is less than in most. Look, probably the most challenging period as a head of mission, that's what we call ambassadors or high commissioners, was in Indonesia over the period of the fall of President Suharto and the Timor crisis, in the sense that that was by far the busiest, and it certainly had the most sustained attention from the capital, Canberra. No question about that. But that was probably the most stimulating and busiest and intense period of my career. I was just like a lot of people. I was sort of figuring out what to do with my life. I didn't have a burning ambition at the age of 18 to be a nuclear scientist or whatever. I really was one of those young men that, was really having a problem figuring out what to do. And I essentially did law because a lot of my mates were doing law and it seemed a good way to go. That's where the advice lay. And so I did. But I joined DFAT a bit later. I practiced as a lawyer for 3 years. But, I didn't really sort of settle down into a job groove until I was 27 or 8. And, the period between university and then, I was still trying to figure out what I really wanted to do with my life. Well, look, it wasn't anything noble like wanting to be a policy representative for my government or doing anything great for my country or anything like that. It'd be nice to say that it was. I think I was attracted by the glamour of it, by foreign climes. This was not a period when it was that easy to get jobs in, say, Southeast Asia or Asia. I mean, there weren't the same number of business jobs. There, you didn't have law offices all over the place. So, this was a real way to get to see and do things in what was still a rather evolving and challenging environment. Asia in the 60s and 70s. So that's what attracted me. It was a kind of boy's own thing, I think, partly. But anyway, I then got more serious, I suppose, as time went by. Oh, look, I think the main thing with any career is an education. I'm not sure that it really matters too much whether it's science or liberal arts or law. I think you can make a case that law does give you a capacity to think and present a case in a logical way. I think there's something to that. But that should happen with, most other disciplines as well. You've got to be logical, and you've got to you've got to argue your presentation, argue what you're doing. I think that's, all to the good. But I think, any good degree involves making you think and making you reason. And I think there are a lot of subjects that help you do that. Law was one of them. Yeah, look, I was a barrister. As it turned out, my parents are Australian, but I was educated in the UK for a number of reasons. And I went to the bar in the UK, was okay, although I was terribly green when you think of what, a young man is asked to do or expected to do with lack of experience. It's mind-boggling now to think of it. But I was there for a while. Then I went as a lawyer in New York. And then in America, I decided to go back to Australia and applied for this particular job. But when did I sort of get really serious working on foreign policy? It probably wasn't until my first tour, which was in Laos. Look, in the embassy in Laos, again, it's this sort of across the board. I was doing immigration, I was doing consular, I was representative on an economic board, which actually affected the rate of exchange of the Lao currency as against the dollar, which had some relevance at the time. And I also got involved in watching what was happening politically at a local level. So it was a very, very varied job. Well, I guess, when you're 21 or 2, you'd like to have known a great deal more. I mean, what struck me was when I joined how little I knew about what was involved. I was attracted by a certain amount of the glamour of it and the variety of it, but I didn't realize, for example, how important written work was. I think I just imagined that I was a sort of glorified talker, charming everybody and, essentially conveying views. But a great deal of the work is actually the written word, and reporting what is said. You've got to put an awful lot of your arguments in writing when you're dealing with other governments. So it was, it was just a totally different job. I think I was attracted by the sort of superficiality of it. I hadn't realized how much actually pretty serious work there is in it. Well, look, I'm asked this question a lot, and there's one basic answer to it, and that is you've got to be interested in the stuff. If you're not interested in what is happening internationally, and that is different from just, oh, I like to visit foreign countries. That's great. Everybody likes that. It's really understanding what makes countries tick. If you're interested in that, it's worth thinking pretty seriously about it. But people are very used to young people coming into interviews and saying, oh yeah, I'm really interested in politics in Southeast Asia. And it's quite clear, with a couple of questions, they know nothing. It's just they like Bali and they like the idea of going to Thailand and so on. So you've really got to demonstrate a real interest. If you're interested, it'll take you a very long way towards a particular career. And that's, I think, the same in any job. Interest is crucial if people are going to be any good at a job. Well, if you read the news, you'll be able to interpret what is going on a lot more easily if you have background. For example, if you see Islamist terrorism emerging in a particular country, it will give you some guide to what's happening if you know the background in that particular country, what is happening within the ruling elite, what the political factions in a particular country think about a given issue, how they treat people in that country. All those things matter. And so, quite clearly the better read you are and the more you understand how countries tick over, the better you are able to make a calculation as to where they're going to behave internationally. Look, I think with any of these degrees, certainly in that sort of broad area of arts, economics, history, and so on, the value is teaching you to think. I mean, I'm repeating myself, but teaching you to think and reason, as well as having broad general knowledge, which is fairly important for an understanding of the world. Now, I think you pick up a certain amount of that just by being intelligent and reading the newspapers. But if you study these things in greater depth, as you would at university, I think it does enhance your capacity to understand the real world and to work in the real world. Well, knowledge. You can't work without knowledge. Then I think secondly, communication skills. That is, that's really important, both written and oral communication skills. And the final thing, which is the same in any job, you've got to work. It's not one of these things that automatically comes easily. There is a lot of drudgery, and you've got to stick at things. And but that's not unique to international relations, but it's certainly part of international relations.